Season greetings. I'm delighted to welcome you to our virtual reading of A Christmas Carol. My name's Tom and I run this beautiful iconic pub, the George in Southwark, London's only surviving galleried coaching inn, and somewhere Charles Dickens himself would sit and watch the city folk go by. Tonight I'm here to fly the flag for all of the great publicans at Green King. We're determined to bring you some festive cheer this year with our glorious Christmas get-together. Green King pubs have been the home of bringing people together in this country for hundreds of years, and this Christmas we're bringing the spirit of Dickens to life with Christmas at our pubs and tonight online. The glorious Christmas get-together is a celebration of the true meaning of Christmas, taking inspiration from one of Dickens' greatest works, A Christmas Carol. This year, more than ever, we appreciate the importance of the people in our life, and as Dickens would have in his day, embracing the season of goodwill to the fullest. I'll be honest with you all, it's been a really tough old year this year, as pubs really missed kicking off the festive season with you all in November. More than ever, we've realised that pubs is such a pillar of British culture, giving people a place to escape and most importantly get together over a drink to put the world to rights. But as you can see, we're still decked the halls, trim those trees, and we'll be raising a cup of Christmas cheer with a substantial meal. And we'll be delighted to host you this Christmas. But if you're unable to be in one of our pubs, I'm really excited to be able to bring my pub to your home tonight. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Lucinda Dickens Hawksley, his great-great-great-granddaughter.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you're nestled in your living room, maybe with the fire crackling, sipping something mulled and ready to hear this classic Christmas tale. Before I begin, we'd love to see how you're enjoying A Christmas Carol tonight. So take a photo and post on social media with the hashtag #GloriousGetTogether. The person with the best photo will win Fizz the Season to go bottomless for two with Christmas dinner and unlimited Prosecco for 2 hours, worth £60. Charles Dickens loved Christmas. It was one of his favourite times of year. When he wrote A Christmas Carol, it was the first of what were 5 Christmas books. And it's said that Dickens changed the way that people celebrate Christmas, not only in Britain, but all around the world. We'd also like to say hello to our VIP winners. Hello Teresa Kennedy, Mark Stevens, and Ashley Louise Hatton, who won an Abbott Ale and Aspal mulled cider hamper to enjoy with A Christmas Carol, as they told us who they'd love to go to the pub with this Christmas. Now I'm going to read to you from A Christmas Carol by my great-great-great-grandfather Charles Dickens. I'll read some excerpts and tell you the story as well. Stave 1, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnised it with an undoubted bargain. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood years afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. Eternal heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, nor wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would drag their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life. Warning all human sympathy to keep its distance was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighbouring offices. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. And so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He'd so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas? What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned the nephew. "What right have you to be dismal? What right have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said "Bah!" again, and followed it up with "Humbug." "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be?" returned the uncle, "when I live in a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas! Out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? Time for finding yourself a year older, not an hour richer. Time for balancing your books and having every item in them gone through a round dozen of months presented dead against you. If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, he should." Scrooge's nephew ignores all of this. He's the son of Scrooge's deceased sister, and what he really wants is for his uncle to come and have Christmas lunch with him and his wife. Scrooge won't even think about it. However, when nephew Fred leaves, he makes a big point of going and talking to Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's clerk, sitting in his freezing cold little cell, and wishing him a Merry Christmas. When Scrooge gets up to say goodbye to his clerk, he's greeted by some men who come in, and they are wanting charity. And Scrooge says some of the most important words in this book. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley's been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago this very night." "We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner. said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been two kindred spirits. At the ominous word, liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman. "And the union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "They're still in operation?" "They are still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I'm very glad to hear it." "Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude," returned the gentleman, "a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it's a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "You wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make myself merry at Christmas, can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I've mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there." "Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it and decrease the surplus population." After the charitable gentlemen leave, Bob Cratchit is told that it's the end of the day and he is allowed to go home. He puts on his scarf, he doesn't have a coat, and he sets out, but not until Scrooge has given him a diatribe about the fact that it's picking a man's pocket every 25th of December to expect to have a whole day off work and not be paid for it. And Bob is told that he needs to come back into work the following day, Boxing Day, earlier than usual. After saying goodbye to his clerk, Scrooge goes and has a miserable supper in a tavern, and then he goes home. And when he gets there, he sees something rather strange. His door knocker, on his door that he's seen for many years, and it's the old home in which Jacob Marley used to live, has become the face of Jacob Marley. Scrooge is disconcerted by this, but he doesn't really think there's anything in it. He just thinks he's being fanciful. And when he gets into his house, he starts to hear strange noises, as if somebody is dragging something around downstairs. Now, he's the only person who lives in this pretty much deserted building. All the rest of it is offices, and they're all closed up. And then he hears some bells. He just can't work out what they are. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise, much louder, on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His colour changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same, Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped around his middle. It was long and wound around him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he'd never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes and marked the very texture of the folded handkerchief bound around its head and chin, which rapper he'd not observed before, he was still incredulous and fought against his senses. "How now," said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular, for a shade." He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of the grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel, in his heart, by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. Jacob Marley then tells him that the chain that he wears was forged by him in life, and that Scrooge, whose chain would have been this bad 7 years ago, must have forged a much longer, heavier, more difficult chain. He tells him that he needs to change, that Jacob is now condemned forever to wander the world as a spirit, constantly seeing people he should be able to help, but he no longer has the capacity to, although now he really, really wants to. And he tells Scrooge that he will be visited that very night by 3 spirits. Scrooge says, "I'd really rather not be. Please, can you tell me everything?" And Jacob insists that there's no other way. And then he leaves. Before he leaves, however, he shows Scrooge all of the other ghosts flying around outside, all of them encumbered by the things that they did wrong in life. And they're there crying over the fact that they can't go and help people who are lying on the streets, many of them desperately hungry, some of them possibly dying, people of all ages, from tiny babies up to elderly people. When Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, it was what was known as the Hungry Forties. The 1840s in Britain was a time of great poverty and deprivation. There'd been the potato famine in Ireland. Many people had fled from Ireland to England, and all of these people were desperate for work and money. The gap between rich and poor in 1840s Britain was enormous. When Dickens wrote this book, he was wanting his readers to see that, like Scrooge, they needed to make a change. Scrooge is woken in the middle of the night by his bed curtains being pulled apart, and there is a strange-looking figure there. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close beside him, it were at a distance. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge. "No, your past." Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap and begged him to be covered. "What?" exclaimed the ghost. "Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?" Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, Your reclamation, then. Take heed. It put out its strong hand as it spoke and clasped him gently by the arm. Rise and walk with me. It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that his bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He arose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication. I'm a mortal, Scrooge remonstrated, and liable to fall. Bear but a touch of my hand there, said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld in more than this. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. Good heavens, said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. I was bred in this place. I was a boy here. The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odours floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. Your lip is trembling, said the ghost. And what is that upon your cheek? Scrooge muttered with an unusual catching in his voice that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. You recollect the way? Inquired the spirit. Remember it, cried Scrooge with fervour. I could walk it blindfold. Strange to have forgotten it for so many years, observed the ghost. Let us go on. The ghost takes Scrooge to his old school, where he sees all the other boys going home for Christmas. He's left there. His father doesn't want him at home, and he whiles away his time at Christmas with his favourite friends, which are the books that he reads. Then the spirit takes him forward to another Christmas, where a little girl comes to see him. This is his sister, Little Fan, actually based upon Charles Dickens' own much-loved older sister, Frances. She says to him, Father's so much nicer now. You can come home for Christmas. This affects Scrooge greatly, and then we move to another scene. There we see the warehouse in which he was apprenticed as a young man after leaving school, and his great friend, his fellow apprentice, Dick Wilkins, who he completely lost touch with, and Mr. Fezziwig, his wonderful employer. Very kindly, the apprentices absolutely adore him, and it's going to be the night of Fezziwig's party. So, together, Ebenezer and Dick Wilkins have prepared the warehouse and turned it into the equivalent of a ballroom. In came a fiddler with a music book and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door but one, who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round, in various stages of affectionate grouping, old top couple always turning up in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again as soon as they got there, all top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" and the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But, scorning rest upon his reappearance, he instantly became again, though there were no dances yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home exhausted on a shutter, and he were a brand new man, resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told him, struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. The next thing that the ghost takes Scrooge to see is the girl he was in love with, Belle. They're happy, they're young and in love, and then we see a scene where she ends their engagement because she says she has been replaced. Scrooge has changed and that now he loves nobody, only money. So she releases him from the tie. He says he doesn't want to be released, but it's very half-hearted. And she says, I know that you don't want to marry me. Scrooge gets quite upset at this, and then even worse, he then sees Belle, older, a mother with children, waiting excitedly for her husband to come home. And when her husband does come home, it turns out it was just before Marley's death. And he says to her, I saw an old friend of yours, Mr. Scrooge, sitting there at his desk, even though his partner's dying. And they talk about him as if he's just of no consequence. Eventually, Scrooge tells the spirit he can't bear to see any more, and the spirit leaves. Scrooge is back in his bed, and he wakes up. He hears a noise coming from his own sitting room, and he goes through, a bit nervous this time. He's starting to learn his lesson. In easy state, upon this couch, there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. Come in, exclaimed the ghost. Come in and know me better, man. Scrooge entered, timidly, and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. I am the ghost of Christmas present, said the spirit. Look upon me. Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple, deep green robe or mantle, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanour, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. You've never seen the like of me before, exclaimed the spirit. Never, Scrooge made answer to it. Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers, born in these later years, pursued the phantom. I don't think I have, said Scrooge. I'm afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, spirit? More than 1,800, said the ghost. A tremendous family to provide for, muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. Spirit, said Scrooge submissively, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. So Scrooge is taken by the ghost. They go flying around the city and down, all the way down to Cornwall, up north, where Scrooge sees people who are in desperate poverty. In Cornwall, he sees miners, and Dickens was particularly interested in the plight of miners, having been to Cornwall and seen the working conditions in which tin miners lived. Throughout this is the ghost of Christmas 1843. Scrooge is being shown the real problems associated with his time. When the ghost says, I have more than 1,800 brothers, he means that every year Scrooge has ignored Christmas. He has ignored one of his brothers. One of the things I find really interesting is when Scrooge suddenly stops being Scrooge the miser and becomes the voice of Charles Dickens. This is when people are seen taking their food to the baker's shop. Now, at this time, the majority of people who lived in poverty would not have had any means in their house by which to heat their food. So when they wanted a hot meal, such as Christmas meal, they would have to take it to the baker's shop, because once the bakers had finished baking their bread for the day, the ovens would still be hot and people could pay a small amount to heat their food. However, something Dickens was concerned about was that bakers' shops had to be closed because of religion on Sundays. This was the only day in the week when poor people were not expected to be at work. So the only day in the week they could have a hot meal. And Dickens puts those words of his into Scrooge's mouth. One thing that Scrooge takes him to is to see the Cratchits, and he also takes them to see Scrooge's nephew. But I'm going to start with the Cratchits having their Christmas lunch. And what you need to know is that Tiny Tim is disabled. He walks with a little crutch, and we know that he is a very, very ill child. Tiny Tim was escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire, and Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth, it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him. In a tiny corner at the table, the two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and, mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board. And even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the apple sauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Now they go on to admire the great pudding, and all of them say that it's the best pudding ever. But nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding. For a large family, it would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. Now, the family have a wonderful day together. They enjoy their Christmas, and they sit around and they toast each other. And then Bob Cratchit, in a very loyal way, takes up his cup, and he says that he is going to toast Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast. And that is when Mrs. Cratchit loses her temper. And of course, Scrooge is watching all this. She says, "The founder of the feast!" And she starts to get really angry. And then he says, My dear, the children. So she toasts Scrooge, but with a very, very bad grace. After they leave the Cratchits' house, Scrooge is taken to see the miners and the other people I mentioned earlier. They go on to his nephew's house. Now, nephew Fred, as we know, had invited Scrooge to come and spend Christmas Day with him, and he does it every single year. And his wife keeps saying to him, "Why'd you bother? He never cares about us." And he says, "He's my uncle and I love him." So Scrooge sees what a great time they're having. Their friends and family all around them, all young people playing games, and he gets so into it that he's joining in. Of course, they can't see him. They have no idea that he's there. But we see that Scrooge is starting to become again a bit like the young man he was at Fezziwig's party. And this is obviously provoking in him the memories of when he was young and happy and a much nicer person than he has become. And the spirit is about to take him away when Scrooge sees that they're about to play another game. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "One half our spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes, and lived in London and walked about the streets and wasn't made a show of, wasn't led by anybody, didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, was not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last, the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I found it out! I know what it is! Fred, I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" After this, Scrooge notices that the spirit is starting to fade away, and he sees sticking out from under his robe what he thinks is an animal's claw. And he asks the spirit, "What is it?" And the spirit says, "Might as well be a claw, for all the flesh there is upon it." And he brings forward 2 children. Wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable, they knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garments. Sorry, I've gone too far. Sorry. I'm going to start that bit again. From the foldings of its robe, it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garments. They were a boy and girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon him, "and they cling to me. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all, beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. That's a part of A Christmas Carol that is often missed out of adaptations, and it makes me really frustrated when I see that, because this was Dickens's entire message for writing this book. A Christmas Carol grew out of when he was asked to write a government report into child poverty. He started to write the report and realised that who would read it? Nobody but a few politicians. So instead, in just 6 weeks, he wrote this book. This was his protest song against child poverty, and ignorance and want are the real meaning of this book, along with the plight of Tiny Tim. And what he was saying when he says, beware them both, especially this boy, is that ignorance is the most frightening thing, because if a child grows up in ignorance, it will become the angry, vicious, violent adult of the future. As the ghost of Christmas Present and the children fade away, the final ghost approaches Scrooge. And this is a very frightening ghost, really kind of often associated with the Grim Reaper. It's wordless. It just points Scrooge to where it wants him to go, and he follows. By this time, he is completely cowed. This is the ghost of Christmas yet to come, and it shows him many very sad things, including the Cratchit family with no Tiny Tim. Bob has been to visit his grave, and in the corner of the room is the little crutch that the boy had used to use. He sees all of these things that make him wretched, and he sees a lot of people that he knows through work standing around the Royal Exchange in London, discussing quite lightheartedly the death of somebody whose name they don't mention. They're all talking about this, and they're kind of laughing and joking. He sees people who are there selling off the garments that this man had been wearing when he died, and none of them have a kind word to say about him. Scrooge has no idea at this point the identity of the dead man. But he is really struck by the fact that nobody has a good word to say. If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agitated, show that person to me, spirit, I beseech you. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment like a wing, and, withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried but in vain to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children in their play. At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed and which he struggled to repress. Is it good, she said, or bad? Bad, he answered. We're quite ruined. No, there is hope yet, Caroline. If he relents, she said, amazed. There is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. He's past relenting, said her husband. He is dead. She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. What the half-drunken woman whom I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and when I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money. And even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes, soften as it would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. So Scrooge then asks the spirit to show him the identity of the person who has died, and the spirit takes him to see a gravestone. And of course, on that gravestone are the words, Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, Scrooge is desperate by this point. He has learnt his lesson, and he begs to know, can I change this? Is this the things that will definitely happen? Or if I make changes in my life, am I able to erase the words on this stone? Can I make a difference if I start now? But the spirit is completely wordless, and he leaves Scrooge, and Scrooge is left wondering. And then Scrooge wakes up. He's in his own bed, and the bed curtains, which he'd seen in the previous episode being bartered away by the people who'd ripped them down after his death, are still there. And he wakes up and he thinks, well, how long has this taken? All these nights travelling with these three spirits. And he leans out of his window and he calls to a boy in the street, what day is it? And the boy looks at him like he's mad and says, well, it's Christmas Day. And Scrooge realises that the whole thing has happened in one night, and that, of course, spirits are magical. They can do whatever they want to. And then Scrooge comes up with a plan. He asks the boy to go and buy the big turkey, the hugest turkey that he's seen, and to bring it back here. And he thinks, I'm going to send it to the Cratchits. It's bigger than Tiny Tim. I'll send it anonymously. They'll have no idea where it's come from. And he gets very excited about this. And he decides that he's going to go out and enjoy Christmas. Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much. And shaving requires attention, even when you don't dance while you're at it. But if he had cut the end of his nose off, he would have put a piece of sticking plaster over it and been quite satisfied. He dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth, as he'd seen them with the ghost of Christmas present. And walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded every one with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, "Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He'd not gone far when, coming on towards him, he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before and said, "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe." It sent a pang across his heart to think how this old gentleman would look upon him when they were met. But he knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it. "My dear sir," said Scrooge, quickening his pace and taking the old gentleman by both his hands. "How do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir. Mr. Scrooge?" "Yes," said Scrooge, "that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you." "Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness—" Here Scrooge whispered in his ear. "Lord bless me," said the gentleman, as if his breath were gone. "My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?" "If you please," said Scrooge, "not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favour?" "My dear sir," said the other, shaking hands with him, "I don't know what to say to such "Don't say anything, please," retorted Scrooge. "Come and see me. Will you come and see me?" "I will," cried the old gentleman, and it was clear he meant to do it. "Thank you," said Scrooge. "I'm much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. Bless you." Scrooge then went to church, and he walked around the streets talking to people. He talked to beggars and presumably gave them money. He talked to children, and he said Merry Christmas to everybody, and they said it back to him. And then he decided he would go to his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he made a dash and did it. "Is your master at home, my dear?" said Scrooge to the girl. Very nice girl. "Yes, sir." "Where is he, my love?" said Scrooge. "He's in the dining room, sir, along with mistress. I'll show you upstairs, if you please." "Thank ye, he knows me," said Scrooge, with his hand already on the dining room lock. "I'll go in here, my dear." He turned it gently and sidled his face in around the door. They were looking at the table, which was spread out in great array, for these young housekeepers are always nervous on such points and like to see that everything is right. "Fred," said Scrooge. Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started. "Why, bless my soul," cried Fred. "Who's that?" It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" Let him in? It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there if he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon. And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come into the tank. His hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hello," growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as rough as he could feign it. "What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?" "I'm very sorry, sir," said Bob. "I am behind my time." "You are?" repeated Scrooge. "Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please." "It's only once a year, sir," pleaded Bob, appearing from the tank. "It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." "Now, I'll tell you what, my friend," said Scrooge. "I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore," he continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again, "and therefore, I am about to raise your salary." Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling to the people in the court for help and a straight waistcoat. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken as he clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I've given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. Bob, make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset. And knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one. So that was A Christmas Carol. Thank you so much for settling in with us this winter's night to hear this classic festive tale. From myself and Green King, we send heartfelt season's greetings. This Christmas, do it like Dickens and visit one of our Green King pubs. We're pretty sure he would have been the first to tuck into a festive burger and an Aspel's mulled cider, or maybe take one away. Where we can be, the pubs are open and ready to give the warmest of welcomes this Christmas. Whatever your plans this December, we hope that you too can enjoy your glorious Christmas get-together and let yourself indulge in a sprinkle of festive cheer.